So our next presenter is Jost, and the title is Why We're Using Machine Translation the Wrong Way. Strategies to using machine translation in creative ways that put the translator into the center of the translation process. Jost co-founded the International Writers Group, LLC, on the Oregon coast. His two latest books are Characters with Character, 50 Ways to Rekindle Your Love Affair with Language, and Encountering Bare Bones Christianity. Jost is a professional translator and language consultant who lives at the Oregon coast. Originally from Hamburg, Germany, he earned his Ph.D. Dissertation on the history of Chinese Bible translation from the University of Hamburg. Okay, Jost, take it away.
Thank you so much. Hey, and I really like Lola, but I don't want you to look away from the screen the next few minutes here. Because I want you to follow my presentation, obviously. Anyway, you guys are way too much fun with all those games that you're playing, and I also feel really honored to follow Lynn. Lynn is one of whether you know that or not, she is really one of the heroes of the machine translation world, and I really appreciate her, and I'm very happy to be following her right here. Also, my name is pronounced Jost, but hey, details. So I would like to talk to you about machine translation. And again, you've heard about machine translation before today, but I will try to talk about machine translation in sort of a practical kind of way. And I hope that some of the information that I am presenting has some value for you. I assume that you are all seeing my screen and that you're hearing me fine. So yeah, Lola is nodding, so everything is good. So I'm going to speak, it's going to be very condensed because I hope to present quite a bit of information to you in a very short amount of time. And this is what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to argue back and forth whether machine translation is useful or not. You've just heard about machine translation from Lynn, from others, and we are past the point of arguing whether it's useful in general. You of course should argue with yourself whether it's useful for yourself, but that's another matter entirely. We are also not going to talk about what I just heard Lynn talk about, that we're not going to talk about whether machine translation is a threat to our profession, or whether the future of our profession in general is threatened. That's not something we're going to cover in this. What we do want to talk about is that MT, machine translation, should be one of the tools in your toolbox. Toolbox meaning your array of tools that you have for your professional translation. I will give a brief overview of the available options for machine translation, and I will suggest what I think of innovative ways to work with machine translation. Now, I want to be really clear that my suggestions are not going to be the only possibilities to work innovatively with machine translation. I think that at this point in time in the profession, we are all still really looking for the best ways to use machine translation. Clearly, I don't have the answers to everything related to that. So it's something that we really have to work on together, how to use machine translation more appropriately than it is being used today. And of course, all of this is going to be argued from the perspective of a translator. I'm a translator myself. I translate English into German. And so this is not going to be argued from the tool vendor's point of view, or from the LSP's point of view, or from anyone else. It's the translators that we are having in our focus here. So let's first, and this is going to be a little stressful, this particular slide here, and I apologize in advance. Let's kind of take a quick run through of what's actually out there as far as machine translation goes. But before you do that, you need to ask yourself, what language combinations you are translating. And what's really important, I think, when it comes to machine translation is that we sometimes we tend to talk very generically about MT as if languages are not even language combinations are not even a consideration there. Of course they are. Language combinations have a huge impact on whether machine translation is helpful or not. In some language combinations, machine translation will be a lot less useful than in others. And in most language combinations, of course, machine translation isn't available to start with. So, it's very important before you look at any of the available options that you have in mind what your language combination or language combinations are and see what answers you find. Now, there is, so just last week, in fact, a Chinese machine translation company called Neotrans came out with a new batch of languages, and they are supporting 346 languages or something, which is amazingly many, which is like almost 3 times as many as Google does. But when they say they support all those languages, that doesn't mean much to start with. That just means that, yes, you can choose that language in your, when you do machine translation with that particular engine. But whether they're supporting those languages well is an entirely different question, of course. All right, let's look at the different engines that are out there. When I say engines, what I really mean is programs. So there are generic engines. What I mean by generic engines is that those are engines that are trained with generic data. So these are engines that have crawled the web, where the programmers have crawled the web, and they use all kinds of information, and the information is not sorted according to subject matter or even quality. Now, there are some ways that they evaluate quality. So, for instance, what they're trying to do is they're trying not to reuse machine translated data for the training of their machine translation engine, which makes kind of sense, but they often fail in that. And those generic engines are the ones that you're all very familiar with: Google Translate, Baidu Translator, Amazon, DeepL, Baidu, and many others. And then there are generic engines with API access. Now, API stands for Application Programming Interface, and API is the technology that allows different computer programs to talk to each other. This might sound really technical, but it is much less technical if you are using a tool like MemoQ that was just raffled off, or Trados, or any of the other tools that allow you to connect to a machine translation engine. Then you are using the API, and you usually activate that API by putting in a specific key. Most of you will know what I'm talking about. That if you are using a CAT tool and using machine translation within the CAT tool, you will at some point have entered a certain key to get access to that machine translation engine. Now, that's really important because if you're using Google or Microsoft or DeepL or whatever on the web, on their web pages, you are actually supplying data to them. You are actually allowing them to use the data that you are translating so that they can further train their engines. But if you're using the API, so if you're using, for instance, your CAT tool to connect to that engine, you, in not all cases, but in the cases of the 3 big ones, Google, Microsoft, and DeepL, you are entering a contract with them that they say, we are not going to use your data because you're paying us to use a service, and in exchange, we are not going to use your data. We're going to translate or machine translate your data, but we're not going to use your data for further training of an engine. Big difference. And this is something that there is still a lot of confusion about. So if you're using an API to connect to Google or Microsoft or DeepL, especially those 3, Amazon, by the way, is not like that, but those 3 are. If you're using the API, they will not use your data. That's really important for you to know to communicate to your clients, because your clients might be worried about you giving their data, because you're translating your client's data to a company like Google or Microsoft or DeepL, and you're not if you're using the API with a machine translation engine. Really important. Then there are customizable engines. What that means is that you can either upload translation memories that you might have collected over the many years of being a translator, or you can upload a glossary or a term base, and with that you train those engines to be translating with the terminology and the style, maybe presumably, that you are using. And many engines are offering ways to translate to customize them. And in different ways. DeepL, for instance, only at this point uses dictionary data or glossary data to train their engine with, and others prefer the TMX way. The problem is that if you are going that route, you will have to continuously train those engines. So if you expect those engines to get better over time, you will have to continue that training process with new data that you might have created between the point that you first trained them and your current point. Then, and to essentially solve that problem, there are also adaptive machine translation engines. And those adaptive machine translation engines are programs that learn from you as you translate. So they look at what you translate and adapt the results that they're displaying to you, adapted to your style or your terminology. One really early one is Lilt. Unfortunately, Lilt is not open to freelance translators anymore unless you work for Lilt. Another one is Modern MT, and I would recommend you to look into Modern MT. It's sort of flying under the radar, but it's a very interesting tool that has a very interesting technology, different than most other tools. Or the RWS Language Cloud, the tool that is native to Trados, of course, also does that. So those are the different kinds of machine translation engines that are out there. Now, the questions that you need to ask yourself in considering using machine translation and in deciding what to do, obviously the first one, does machine translation help me? And that's a question that you cannot answer from a vacuum. You have to have experience to be able to answer that question. So you have to have translated some with machine translation engines, and maybe you have hopefully used different strategies to use machine translation to make an informed decision on whether machine translation helps you. The next question that you need to ask yourself, of course, always important, is what do my clients want? If your clients say machine translation use for whatever reason is completely out of the question, well, question is answered, right? You're not going to use machine translation. But if your clients have either no opinion or really want you to use machine translation, that of course is helpful also. And then another question that you have to ask yourself, if you are thinking about working with customized, so engines that can be adapted to the way of your writing style and terminology, you need to ask yourselves whether it makes sense to, whether you have the time to invest into building and maintaining those engines. And lastly, of course, you need to ask yourself, how am I going to work with MT? And that's really what this is about here, this presentation. So the typical way that a machine translation is thought of from the rest of the world, if you will, as relating to the translator, is it is thought of as something that the translator needs to post-edit. So the idea is that you get a raw machine translation, so a a suggestion that the machine translation puts out, which can be really good, which can be really terrible, or usually somewhere in between. And then you then have to fix the errors in that suggestion. And that's what post-editing essentially means. So the problem is that this is not something that we came up with, translators. The problem is that this is something that machine translation developers and many, especially, large language service providers, translation agencies came up with. They thought about, the results of the machine translation engine that is bought or that is built are relatively good idea for the translator to fix it. And that's what the translator should do. But that's not really what we ever suggested as translators. Of course, we are not as homogeneous a group that we can suggest something per se, but it's important that to realize that the typical way of working with machine translations is really not something that we ask for. What we really ask for is this here, I think. In my opinion, that's what I ask for. I ask for a system where I, the linguist, the translator, I'm in the middle. I'm the hub that everything else is grouped around. And all those tools around me, translation memory, terminology management, project management, and the neural MT are just tools that I'm using. And that's very different to using machine translation as something that I just fix. When I fix something, I'm an object. When I stand in the middle, I'm a subject, and I want to be a subject. I want to be the agent of my process. And that's really important to think about. I gave you a link down here. This is a link to a discussion on Twitter that just happened last week or the last couple of weeks. So xlate.link is a link shortener. And so if you go to xlate.link/Twitter discussion, you'll find some interesting ideas related to not this in particular, but overall to the use of machine translation. I don't agree with everything that was said in that discussion, but some interesting ideas you will find in there for sure. So how else can we look at machine translation, if not the post-editing route? We definitely should look at machine translation as one of many resources. We don't just want to interact with that one resource. We have worked for years to build up our own resources, and we want to use them because we know they're good. Our terminology databases, our translation memories, our corpora, etc., etc. We should also expect that these resources that we have, that they talk to each other. What I mean, of course, is not talk, but what I mean is that they should be able to communicate programmatically with each other so they can exchange information and make each other better in the process. And I will show you in a second what I mean. And another thing that we sometimes forget is that, so I gave you an idea of what's out there for machine translation engines. There's, of course, much more out there than what I suggested in there. And really what we should be thinking about is, so we have, let's say, 5 or 8 or 10 different options to use machine translation engines. I know that one of them will most likely have really good information for my segment to be translated or for my text to be translated, but I don't know which one. So why don't I use all of them at the same time? And you'll see in a second what I mean by that. I want to show you a quick demonstration here. I hope that this is going to play for you. I actually don't see let's see where that plays. This is actually not a new presentation. This is several years old, and this is in a tool that I actually would not recommend necessarily, a tool called Déjà Vu, which is not really very actively developed anymore, but they had some really good ideas how to use machine translation. And I will tell you right now what you're going to see in this. So this is pre-recorded, and I'm not going to, because if I do it live, I always mistype and stuff. And what you're going to see is 2 things, essentially. The first example that you're going to see is that a fuzzy translation memory match went out to a machine translation and asked the machine translation to fix it. The fuzzy translation memory match that we'll find will have just one word differently, and it just didn't know what that one word was. My tool didn't have the answers to that, but it knew that the machine translation will have the answer to that. So went out to the machine translation and didn't ask the machine translation to translate the whole segment, but just that one word. That's the first example that you'll see. And the second example is what I just talked about before, that I'm using actually several machine translation engines at the same time, and not necessarily because I want to take their whole suggestion, but I just want to use fragments. And you will see in a second how that works. Let's see whether this plays here on you for you. Does it? Does it? It does. Okay, so you can see this is a fuzzy match. We pair it with machine translation. And you can see that I got two different suggestions for the word yellow. Of course, yellow is in the machine translation, and it was made perfect with the help of machine translation. So this here is the example where I have down below 3 different machine translation suggestions, and none of them is very much liked by me, but the different fragments from different machine translation engines are liked and therefore useful to me. So you can see that I was able to translate that segment really quickly in what I think to be perfect German by using fragments from many different machine translation engines. I mean, that maybe this doesn't sound so cool to you, but it's actually really cool, because you are not, you are the agent, you are doing the work, you are doing the translation work. You were very fast and you have a good result, and you have been able to harvest, and I was able to harvest it by using that auto suggest feature that this tool also offers, by harvesting from a number of different machine translation engines. So really clever way of using machine translation, I think. Oh, we're not going to do it again. So what we need to do is we need to be creative. We need to find good ways to use technology. I think it's really instructive to look at translation memory. Translation memory was introduced in the early 1990s and essentially was completely stagnant for at least 15 or 20 years until subsegment matching was introduced. Subsegment matching, most of you are so familiar with it, you don't even think about it. But in early translation memory, we only looked at the whole segment and not at the parts of the segment. The parts of the segment that are so much more interesting, usually in the whole segment. That's what we think today. But for the longest time, the tool vendors didn't even think about looking at that kind of data. Only when we eventually said, we want to look at that data because that's really interesting for us. We don't get perfect matches all the time. Perfect matches are, 1 in 20 or something. I mean, every 20th segment might be a perfect match from translation memory. But the fragments, the parts of speech that I find in my translation memory matches are really interesting, and I want to use them. So once we ask for it, they actually try to introduce that. And so what we need to do, I think, is the same. We need to do the same for machine translation. We need to insert ourselves into the process and help the developers to go into a way, whether it's the CAT tool developers that like I just showed you, that use machine translation in a certain way, or whether it's the machine translation developers that produce those suggestions. And, we sometimes think that we as translators don't have buying power. I recently looked into the number of translators worldwide, and nobody knows that number. It's sort of a, well, nobody knows that number, but there is at least 3 million translators worldwide. 3 million professional translators. That is so many. For the longest time, we have thought there is just a few 100,000. We know today there is 3 million translators worldwide. That's immense buying power. Now, not all of those translators will be able to use that buying power because they might be in economic situations where they don't have that power, but still a lot of power for us to use our voice and put our dollar or whatever currency we use where our mouths are. So, oh, that's it. Oh, But I do want to give you an opportunity. You might know or might not know that I wrote a book, and I've just recently brought in a colleague of mine, Nora Diaz. This is a book that's more than 500 pages, and it costs $50. But today and the rest of the days in December, I would like to make you a special deal. So you can go to xlate.link/toolbox, and you will pay however the date in December is. So today you would pay $17, tomorrow you pay $18, and so on and so forth. You just have to enter the holidays 2022. It's a book that gives you all the information that we had in here, plus much, much more about tools, technology, etc. So thank you very much, and I hope to be able to see you on Twitter if you are on Twitter.
All right, thank you very much. Jost, that was a great presentation. If anyone has any questions, please raise your virtual hand. You can also put them in the chat and we can read them out. Lots of comments. Again, our great presentation, excellent presentation from Lynn. Great tips, which is high praise. So if anyone has a question, please raise your virtual hand.
And just a brief comment about just like the toolbox. I remember buying the toolbox, your first toolbox around 20 years ago, and it was mind-blowing, like the information and the education and the learning. So if you can please post the actual link on the chat, that would be great, Jost.
I will. Thank you. I did. Thank you.
Yeah, so it looks like we don't have any questions. Again, all these they're all keynotes, and so they're all so thorough. They cover everything that we need, which is great. If you have a question, put it in the chat. Jost can maybe get to it after. I think the link, Lola just posted it, which is great. And so we will move on to our next presenter.